Snow fell silently on the Ardennes forests. It was December 1944, and the Western Front seemed to have stabilized. The soldiers believed that winter would bring calm. But under the trees, in the thick, icy fog, something older than fear awaited. Surprise. When the tanks began to roar in from the east, the sky was still cloudy, and for many, hell had just opened. In the first days of December, despite logistical problems and fuel shortages, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had managed to secretly assemble more than 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of vehicles. Among those chosen for the offensive were veteran units such as the 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr, and new Volksgrenadier divisions made up of inexperienced young men and decorated veterans from the Eastern Front. It was an explosive mix. They were joined by paratrooper units, engineer battalions, and special forces trained to infiltrate enemy lines in Allied uniforms. The code name was Wacht am Rhein, the Guard on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive designation to throw enemy intelligence services off the scent. But there was nothing defensive about the plan. Hitler had conceived a total breakthrough operation which sought to advance with speed westward, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and isolate the British 21st Army Group from the American 12th Army Group. The objective was to sow chaos, force the Allies to negotiate, break their political will, and allow the Reich to reorganize its Eastern Front before the expected Soviet attack. Despite the magnitude of the operation, secrecy was maintained with chilling efficiency. The deception worked. Allied aircraft, unable to conduct reconnaissance flights because of bad weather, failed to detect the massive troop movements. British and US intelligence, confident that Germany had no offensive capability, dismissed any hint of anomalous activity. Eisenhower did not think it possible. Bradley did not consider it likely. Even Montgomery, ever suspicious, did not see the real danger. The surprise would be absolute. On December 11th, in a bunker camouflaged among the trees of Ziegenberg, Hitler gathered his closest commanders. His voice sounded firm, almost trance-like. He spoke to them of history, of greatness, of the need for a coup that would change the course of the war. Some generals were silent, others nodded. Sepp Dietrich, von Manteuffel, Hasso von Manteuffel, Hans Krebs, Alfred Jodl, all knew the gamble was immense, almost suicidal, but they also knew it was the last chance to change destiny. Meanwhile, in the nearby German villages, columns of vehicles were piling up, hidden in barns and tunnels. The orders were clear: no shooting, no firing, no unnecessary movement. Everything was to remain invisible until the last minute. On the icy roads of the Eifel, Tiger and Panther tanks were covered with branches, while their crews slept in the mud. In the artillery positions, howitzers were loaded and aimed, waiting for the signal. The night of December 15th was tense, dense, frozen, a silence of gunpowder before the explosion. At 5:30 in the morning of December 16th, the earth shook. More than 1,600 German guns began to spew fire on the American lines. Within minutes, artillery shattered command positions, communications, and outposts. Amid the confusion, armored columns began to advance through the fog, preceded by reconnaissance groups and sappers cutting through the obstacles. The Ardennes were once again being pierced by German steel. Frost-covered tanks emerged from the forest, followed by trucks with Volksgrenadier infantry. American lines were broken in multiple sectors. Entire units disappeared amid the mud and fire. The front was crumbling. The great German offensive had begun. The objective, clear and brutal, was to launch a massive offensive across the Ardennes, break the Allied front at its weakest point, advance with overwhelming force towards the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and cut the British 21st Army Group off from the rest of the front. If the Germans succeeded in reaching the Belgian port, all Allied logistics would collapse, supply lines would be cut, and the northern armies would be trapped without fuel, without direction, without the possibility of retreat. Hitler was convinced that the British, fearful of a catastrophe like that of 1940, would demand immediate negotiation. And with the British weakened, he imagined, the Americans would also hesitate. They didn't quite trust each other, and he knew how to exploit those cracks. The plan, however, had demands that bordered on the unrealistic. The offensive required advancing more than 150 kilometers through mountainous terrain, with narrow roads and fragile bridges in the dead of winter and without air support. To achieve this surprise effect, the German High Command had to deploy more than 2,000 armored vehicles and dozens of divisions in secret, behind the back of one of the most sophisticated reconnaissance networks in the world. In addition, fuel was in short supply. The Wehrmacht had no reserves to sustain a long-range offensive. The solution was almost absurd: advance so fast that American fuel could be captured along the way. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. But inside the plan was more than a line of advance. There was an ideological vision. Hitler saw this strike as a way to regain control of the narrative, to demonstrate that the Reich was still capable of launching massive attacks, to bring the war back to the West, to force the Allies to sit down at a negotiating table before the Soviets crossed the Vistula and reached the Oder. For him, each passing day was a countdown to the collapse of the Eastern Front, and in that he was clear-headed. He knew that if Berlin fell to the Soviets before a solution in the West, there would be nothing left of the old order he was trying to restore. The plan was structured along three main lines. In the north, Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army was the spearhead. Its armor, including the fearsome Königsteiger, was to break through the Losheim sector and advance towards Malmedy, Stavelot, and finally Liège. It was the most direct route to the Meuse and then to Antwerp. Dietrich had been an early Hitler loyalist, a brutal if unrefined man of action. His divisions, especially the Leibstandarte and the Hitlerjugend, bore the notoriety of atrocities committed in the East. Their advance would be fierce, no prisoners, no truce. In the center, General von Manteuffel led the 5th Panzer Army. This axis was to pass through Clairvaux, Houffalize and Bastogne, and coordinate the advance with Dietrich from the southern flank. Von Manteuffel was a pragmatic officer with experience and a certain autonomy of judgment. His group included the Panzer Lehr, Volksgrenadier units and armored divisions recovered from the Eastern Front. It was the most flexible sector, and perhaps the most likely to succeed, since its initial route was less fortified. Finally, in the south, Brandenberger's 7th Army was to protect the left flank of the offensive and prevent the Americans from counterattacking from the south, especially from the Luxembourg region. Although a secondary effort, this force was to contain several Allied divisions and keep them distracted while the panzers advanced northward. But not everything was played out on the ground. Part of the plan included sabotage and confusion operations. Otto Skorzeny, famous for rescuing Mussolini from the Gran Sasso, organized a special unit composed of English-speaking Germans who would wear enemy uniforms. These commandos were to infiltrate behind Allied lines, change road signs, destroy radios, cut communications, and sow chaos. Operation Greif was a psychological gamble. If US soldiers could be made to believe that their own lines were compromised, it would generate distrust, paranoia, internal detentions. An enemy without cohesion cannot sustain a defense. To cover up the magnitude of the deployment, the Germans resorted to all kinds of subterfuge. Troops moved at night with lights off among the snowy roads of the Eifel. Tanks were transported by train to the nearest stations and then dispersed in empty farms and depots. Communications were maintained by couriers or buried cables. A camouflage network was created with false structures, simulated movements, and coded messages. The deception was so effective that not even low-ranking officers knew with certainty the objective of the operation until the last moment. Hitler himself controlled every detail. He became obsessed with maps, with the disposition of divisions, with advanced schedules. He rejected proposals from his generals calling for a more limited offensive. He wanted a crushing blow, one that would go down in history as the Reich's counteroffensive. And for that he needed everything to be perfect. He did not accept hesitation. Anyone who did not trust the operation would be left on the sidelines. On December 14th, the High Alert Order was issued. The units were informed. Maps, timetables, routes of advance were distributed. Officers were ordered to explain to their men that victory was within reach. Many believed it. Others, especially veterans of the Russian front, knew that an offensive in winter, with no air superiority, with fuel shortages, could have only one destination: exhaustion. The offensive begins. T was the dawn of December 16th, 1944. Along a 130-kilometer stretch of the Western Front, tens of thousands of German soldiers crouched in wait. Among them were veteran paratroopers, young Volksgrenadier recruits, members of the Waffen-SS and camouflaged gunners. It had been hours since anyone had spoken. Every lit cigarette was covered with a palm. Every glance was to the east, waiting for the first flash. At 5:30, the sky exploded. More than 1,600 fire hydrants, from heavy guns to mortars and Nebelwerfer, broke the silence with a storm of steel. The American front line, which thought it was in a zone of repose, shook amid explosions, fire and screams. From Monschau to Echternach, the earth shook as if awakening from a slumber. Telephone lines were immediately cut. Observation posts were reduced to smoking craters. Many American soldiers died before they realized they were under attack. The initial blow fell with surgical precision and unexpected brutality on the most vulnerable sectors of the Allied front. It was no coincidence. The German High Command had meticulously selected the Ardennes area, not only for its winding forest roads and apparent safety, but for the presence of inexperienced American divisions, distributed in depth to rest, regroup, or carry out secondary surveillance missions. These troops, many of them barely arrived from the United States or from quieter sectors of the front, had been set up like chess pieces for a game they were completely unfamiliar with. In the area of the Schnee Eifel, a wooded and elevated promontory of difficult access, the 106th Infantry Division occupied a seemingly secure position. Newly arrived from the United States, it was a green unit with no real combat experience, and its deployment had been considered an opportunity to acclimate itself to war without great risk. Its outposts were poorly connected, artillery was scattered, and its officers were still learning to operate in European winter conditions. Snow covered the trails and back roads, muffling the passes and concealing the enemy's true intentions. It was precisely there that the Germans attacked with the greatest determination. Units of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by elements of the 62nd Volksgrenadier and supported by armored detachments of the 47th Panzer Corps, burst through the fog-covered valleys in the early morning of December 16th. The fog, thick as a veil of smoke, reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. The American sentries barely had time to raise the alarm. In some sectors, artillery fire fell on telephone lines and destroyed command posts even before orders to reply were given. The Germans advanced like a marabout through the trees. Reconnaissance teams preceded the main battalions on skis or bicycles, cutting wires, infiltrating rear positions and sowing chaos on the flanks. Panzer columns followed close behind, with Panther and Panzer IV tanks maneuvering with difficulty along the icy forest roads, but with shattering aggression. Every road junction, every intersection, every bridge that remained intact was a strategic point to be taken in minutes. There was no room for delay. Speed was the essential weapon of the attack. In the villages of Blealf, Au and Schönberg, detachments of the 106th Division were overwhelmed by waves of grenadiers. Confusion gripped the American lines. Maps were out of date, radios jammed by the Germans, reinforcements unable to advance because of bottlenecks on the few passable routes. In some sectors, entire units of the 422nd and 423rd Infantry regiments were surrounded without their commanders knowing that there was no longer an organized front behind them. They were caught between two converging German forces, a moving pincer that was closing by the hour. German artillery fire was constant and accurate. It was not just shelling. Short bursts were used to isolate positions, disrupt movements, and cover infantry advances. The psychological impact was immediate. The American soldiers, many of them young men who had never seen combat, faced a winter offensive launched with a professionalism and ferocity that no one expected at that stage of the war. Bullets whistled through the pines, shells cratered the frozen roads, and trees exploded on direct hits, sending splinters like spears through bodies and tarpaulins. Some posts held out until ammunition was exhausted. In other cases, defenses were improvised with overturned jeeps, frozen sandbags, and rifles aimed at empty roads. But it was futile. The German tide would not let up. Within hours, the forward detachments were reaching places the Allied General Staff did not think possible. The road from Blealf to Schönberg fell to the enemy by nightfall of the first day, and German tanks crossed the Our without meeting consistent resistance. It was a dark torrent, a stream of steel and smoke that swept everything in its path. Where there should have been full divisions, there were only isolated points of resistance, and where once there had been clear roads, there were now columns of jammed vehicles covered by snow, smoke, and fire. The American units, surprised by the magnitude of the German attack, tried to fall back in all directions, but there was no longer a rear guard, no clear command, no safe roads. At Clairvaux, the 110th Infantry Regiment was holding out in ruins. The first hours of the attack had left it without effective artillery, and with only a few anti-tank pieces that were extinguished one by one under the weight of the German armor. The infantry, without air support or reinforcements, dug in the buildings of the center, fighting house to house until the radio went silent and the survivors began to retreat on foot along forest trails. Colonel Hurley Fuller, regimental commander, was captured at his command post. Withdrawal turned to flight. A few miles to the east, the 106th Infantry Division disintegrated. Made up of raw soldiers, many of them still without real combat experience, it was trapped in the Schnee Eifel, a region of densely wooded hills that became death traps. The Germans, with precise maps and a well-calculated road network, completely surrounded 2 entire regiments. When they finally surrendered, more than 7,500 American soldiers passed into enemy hands in one of the largest capitulations on the Western Front. At Saint-Vith, General Bruce Clark improvised a defensive line with scattered elements of several divisions. The city was a communications nerve center, and for that reason, a priority target for the Germans. The roads were filled with retreating columns, ambulances, broken tanks, jeeps with disoriented officers. With each passing hour, the encirclement became tighter. Units tried to get out by back roads, but snow, mud, and trees felled by German engineers blocked everything. Many were forced to abandon vehicles and retreat on foot, carrying wounded and throwing into the ditches everything they could not drag. Clark's troops held out until December 23rd, when the city was finally evacuated. In the process, they gained vital time for the front to stabilize to the west. Further north, between Bullingen and Stavelot, the bridges were beginning to collapse under the pressure of traffic and shelling. The retreat was in chaos, tanks backing up against the road, soldiers abandoning positions on their own, trucks skidding on icy curves and blocking entire columns for hours. Officers tried to impose discipline, but fear was stronger than orders. In many sectors, men walked alone, aimlessly, following the crowd or the smoke from the fires. At Wiltz, the scene was repeated. The defenders, mostly from the 112th Regiment, dug in the center of town and held out until their ammunition was exhausted. When the German tanks began to penetrate through the narrow streets, the retreat was immediate. There were no open routes to Bastogne. The last to escape did so by bicycle or by walking through the fields, leaving behind vehicles, heavy weapons, and wounded comrades. Many ended up in the ranks of ad hoc units formed by the American rearguard at Bastogne, where they would be rearmed and returned to the front in even more desperate conditions. Meanwhile, at the Corps command posts, communications were collapsing. Telephone lines were cut. Radio operators were constantly changing frequencies to avoid German interference, and messages arrived hours late when they were no longer useful. General Bradley, in Luxembourg, was trying to rebuild the front line with what he had: units from reserve, logistic services, artillery battalions with just a few guns. Each report that came in was worse than the last. And in the midst of all that, one constant: panic. The feeling of being surrounded, that the enemy could appear from any direction, even disguised as an American soldier. The fear of infiltrated German commandos who spoke English, who gave false orders, who diverted entire columns, grew every day. At the most important intersections, military policemen asked for state capitals or the name of the Yankee catcher to identify infiltrators. The distrust was total. It was not an orderly retreat. It was a partial disbandment, a desperate survival in the midst of a storm of steel. The difference between living or dying could depend on a curve, on a bridge not blown, on a grenade that did not explode. At each junction, decisions were made within seconds of each other: stay or flee, retreat or resist. And for many, retreat was not an option. The only thing left to do was to fight with whatever was at hand. The retreat of those early days marked the low point of the campaign for the Allies. It was also the prelude to their recovery. For while thousands fled westward, thousands more prepared to return to combat. At Bastogne, at Dinant, at Marche, new lines were beginning to form. But between December 16th and 20th, the front collapsed like a broken dam, and in that crack the enemy crept in like a flood. The SS advanced without stopping. The short days of winter meant that night fell on Belgium even before the fear dissipated. On December 17, 1944, barely 24 hours after the start of the offensive, the skies over the Ardennes were still closed, the roads were turning into rivers of frozen mud, and the men were beginning to understand that they were not facing a simple counterattack. The 6th SS Panzer Army was advancing like a dark mass along the snow-covered roads, and among its fastest units was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the vanguard chosen by the Reich to break through to the Meuse River. Joachim Peiper, a young Waffen-SS colonel, was as brilliant as he was brutal. He had made his career under Himmler's wing, was part of the fanatical old guard of the Adolf Hitler Leibstandarte, and now had the mission to break through to the American front with speed, fire, and decisiveness. His column included the heaviest tanks of the war, Tigers and Panthers. Behind them marched half-tracks, ammunition trucks, self-propelled artillery, motorcycles, all in line on country roads trying to advance towards the objective, to cross the Meuse, take bridges and continue towards Antwerp. But the terrain did not help. The roads were narrow, villages forced detours, ambushes slowed the advance. Peiper, impatient, ordered to continue at all costs. He wanted fuel, he needed speed, he wanted to open a deep breach before the enemy could react. At noon, the column captured the village of Bullingen and found an American fuel depot there. The find was providential, hundreds of full drums, truckloads. The SS quickly refueled and continued their march with renewed impetus. The route took them towards Malmedy. Near the Bornier crossing, in a tree-lined open field, a U.S. light artillery convoy ran into Peiper's armor. They were about 130 men of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They had been ordered to withdraw, but the road was saturated. Little did they know that the German spearhead had already overtaken them. When they saw the tanks appear, they understood that they were trapped. With no options, they raised their hands. The soldiers were disarmed and massed in an open field. The air was tense. The prisoners stood disoriented, grouped together beside their wrecked vehicles. Some SS stood watch with weapons at the ready. Suddenly, without warning, a shot rang out, then another, and then a burst. One of the German soldiers opened fire. The rest followed. The machine guns began to spit bullets at the unarmed Americans. Many fell immediately. Others tried to flee into the grove. They were pursued, executed, shot in the back. In all, 84 men died. Some were finished off with pistol shots at close range. Several survivors managed to feign death under the bodies of their comrades. As night fell and the SS moved away, some of the wounded dragged their bodies to nearby farms to alert the Allied authorities. The message was slow in coming, but when it did, the impact was devastating. News of the massacre spread quickly among U.S. troops. The effect was immediate. Any notion that the enemy could be dealt with by the conventional rules of war was ended. Orders changed. Patrols stopped taking prisoners. Fear spread, but so did an icy fury. In the following days there were reprisals in several units. The word Malmedy became synonymous with summary execution. But Peiper did not stop. His column, still nourished, continued on its way to Stavelot. The town was on the edge of the Amblève, and resistance there was fiercer. Although they managed to take the bridge and cross with part of the group, the civilian population was caught in the crossfire. The SS occupied houses, eliminated defensive points, set fire to buildings. At Trois Ponts, a demolition counter-order blew up a key bridge just before the German tanks arrived. The route to the Meuse was narrowing. Logistics began to crack. Time lost in skirmishes, bridges destroyed by the Americans themselves, and growing local resistance slowed the advance. Peiper needed fuel and fast routes, but encountered flank fire and muddy roads. At La Glaise, his group was partially encircled. The rear units could not catch up. The front was not moving. Allied pressure increased with every hour. While the Air Force was still unable to operate, the ground forces began to organize pockets of resistance. Villages were turned into fortifications. Intersections were mined. The enemy was beginning to retreat without falling back. Peiper's column, which at dawn had broken through the lines with overwhelming fury, was now beginning to get caught in its own audacity. The narrow roads of the Ardennes, covered with ice and snow, were becoming deadly traps. Ambushes by American engineers and anti-tankers, the deliberate destruction of bridges and chronic fuel shortages were crippling their advance. Peiper, leading an elite force designed for speed and shock, found himself surrounded by hostile villages, with no air cover, no reinforcements, and no clarity on the front. What had been a spear intended to split the enemy in two was becoming an isolated island, pushed westward more by the inertia of the plan than by any real possibility of victory. As the days passed, the legend of Peiper and his men grew in Allied reports. Their presence was feared, their brutality known. But mistakes were also multiplying. Passing through Stoumont, his tanks clashed with a company of Shermans from the U.S. 740th Battalion. The surprise was not enough. The German armor got stuck on the snowy roads. One by one, they began to burn under enemy fire. Peiper decided to dig in. By December 24th, the Kampfgruppe was cornered at La Glaise. No fuel, no escape routes, no reinforcements. After destroying what was left of their tanks and vehicles, Peiper and a small group managed to escape on foot, camouflaged in the forest. The advance of the German vanguard had been halted. The 101st defends Bastogne. For any army that aspired to cross the Ardennes, Bastogne was the key. Whoever controlled it would dominate the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and tanks. And in December 1944, when the German offensive burst into the region with the violence of a steel storm, all roads led there. The Wehrmacht understood this well. From the west came the armored units of the 47th Panzer Corps, commanded by General von Manteuffel, determined to capture the city before the Americans could reinforce it. But it was too late. Although the front had been taken by surprise, the Allied commanders had reacted with the speed of instinct. On December 19th, the 101st Airborne Division, reorganized after the battles of Normandy and Holland, was ordered to move urgently. There was no time to prepare supplies. They jumped on trucks, loaded what they could, and set off eastward into the blizzard. They were hardened soldiers, but no one was ready for what was to come. When the first elements of the division entered Bastogne, the inhabitants still believed that the Germans would come at any moment. They were not wrong. Enemy armored columns were already encircling nearby villages, crossing icy bridges, destroying communications, and closing in with fire. There was no front line, only a slowly closing trap. The improvised defense took shape with what was there: paratroopers, elements of the 10th Armored Division, administrative troops, engineers, medics, cooks. Everyone received a weapon and a sector. General Anthony McAuliffe assumed command in the absence of 101st Commander Maxwell Taylor. The city, surrounded by woods, was divided into combat sectors. Every entrance was blocked. Every street was covered by crossfire. It was not an orderly defense, but a desperate attempt to stem the tide. The cold was another enemy. Temperatures were dropping below -20 degrees Celsius. Men dug with bayonets into the frozen ground. There were not enough winter uniforms. Some wore sheets as camouflage. Rations were scarce, ammunition even more so. The wounded were cared for in cellars without light or medicine. Surgeons operated with shaking hands. Trees were blown up by artillery and threw wood splinters like shrapnel. From December 20th, German attacks became constant. Troops of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division assaulted from the north, attempting to take Noville, a key village. They were repulsed by a mix of US paratroopers and tanks who held out house to house. To the south, the panzers tried to make their way along the road to Neufchâteau. There they were ambushed among snow-covered trees and mines buried under the frozen leaf litter. Each advance was answered with a counter-ambush. Bastogne did not fall. On December 22nd, a German officer appeared under a white flag with an ultimatum: unconditional surrender in 2 hours or total bombardment. McAuliffe's reply was laconic, a single word: nuts. The German courier did not understand the term. It was explained to him, "Tell them it means to go to hell." The message was accurately conveyed. The German messengers, shod in frozen boots, carried it to the advanced lines while the fog still covered the forests like an opaque cloak. It was brief, forceful, and ritualistic. The city had to surrender. Bastogne was a thorn in the Wehrmacht's throat. If it did not fall, the offensive impulse would lose all meaning. But the answer was dry as a slap in the face: nuts. That same afternoon, German artillery began to punish the city with precision fire. 88mm guns, 105mm and 150mm pieces set up among the hills and forest clearings, launched a continuous storm of shells on the Allied positions. Churches, schools, stone houses with slate roofs, everything that once had windows and doorbells were transformed into rubble. Smoke covered courtyards and alleys, carrying with it the ash of walls that burst into fragments. Flames climbed the bell towers like ghoulish torches, cutting across the leaden-grey sky of the Ardennes. The days that followed were a circle of hell. German tanks, Panzer IV and Panthers, tried to break the encirclement from different directions. To the north, at Noville, they were repulsed by direct fire and close-range attacks. To the east, they crossed the creek between Majoret and Nef, pushing with mixed columns of armor and grenadiers marching through charred trees. In the south, the German 5th Parachute Division launched a night offensive with automatic rifles and grenade launchers, hoping to find the weakest flanks. But on all fronts, they found something unexpected: resistance to the point of fanaticism. The Americans had dug trenches in the freezing snow, covered with camouflage tarpaulins, reinforced with wood from collapsed barns. From there they fired with 60mm mortars, Garand rifles and Browning machine guns. Anti-tank mines, laid along rural roads and side approaches, exploded under the Panthers' tracks with dry bursts. Soldiers were making Molotov cocktails in beer bottles, using motor oil and gasoline from the wrecked trucks. One sergeant was seen throwing one of these bottles from the second floor of a collapsed bakery, smashing it into the hatch of an armored car that was still warm inside. The Germans, for their part, employed all available resources. They infiltrated commandos disguised in captured uniforms, spoke English with accents, moved road signs to disorient reinforcements, laid mines on alternate routes, and occupied houses on the periphery for use as machine gun nests. During one night, a column of captured trucks driven by SS troops managed to break through the lines and wreak havoc on the western flank before being reduced to bazooka fire by a patrol of the 101st Airborne Division. The cold became another enemy. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers slept under frost-covered ponchos in flooded cellars in half-destroyed churches. The icy wind cut lips, gangrened feet, and froze the water in canteens. M1 rifles failed from hardened lubricant. Grenades failed to explode from condensation. One soldier recalled trying to write a letter to his mother, but the pencil snapped between his numb fingers. No one spoke. Only the crunching of snow under worn boots, the engine of a generator in the distance, and the cyclic whirring of enemy shells could be heard. In the makeshift hospitals, wounds were treated with what was available. Stretchers made of doors, bandages made of cut-up blankets, rationed morphine. Doctors worked in shifts without rest under the trembling light of kerosene lamps. There were wounded who were covered with sandbags to keep warm. In the basement of the Saint-Pierre convent, where there was a surgical post, the screams of the amputees mingled with the prayers of the nuns who attended to the dying. Bastogne was transformed into a medieval siege, but with tanks and modern artillery. The streets, once decorated with Christmas garlands, were covered with barbed wire, craters, and rubble. Christmas trees were scorched, mixed in with the remains of burnt-out cars. Colored lights were replaced by sparklers for illumination. A chapel was used as an ammunition depot. An elementary school was converted into a command post. The blackboard still held incomplete lessons on French grammar. Every building became a defense position. In Rue de Neufchâteau, a 3-story house was defended for 2 days by a platoon of 10 men who withstood attacks with flamethrowers, direct artillery, and demolition charges. When they were relieved, only 3 were left standing, their hands black with smoke and their eyes glazed over. They did not know what day it was. The skirmishes went on and on. Outlying villages changed hands during the night. At dawn, a reconnaissance patrol might encounter an enemy battalion hidden in the wreckage of a sawmill. An artillery post advanced 20 meters and retreated 40. The lines were blurred, the front blurred. The war had become a fight street by street, room by room, tree by tree. There was no advance, only resistance. Major Julian Cook, one of the veterans of the Nijmegen Bridge, wrote in his notebook that Bastogne was a throat surrounded by knives. Every day, every hour, was about survival. No one spoke of victory. No one spoke of surrender. There was only fighting, out of habit, out of instinct, not to let the comrade next to you die alone. In the center of Bastogne, the field hospitals were filled with frozen wounded. Some soldiers underwent amputations without anesthesia. Blankets were shared by 3. Rations were reduced to 1 per day. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready, but the skies were still closed. Allied aircraft could not fly, and the men, day after day, knew only that they were surrounded and alone. On December 23rd, the clouds began to dissipate. A ray of sunshine broke through the blackened forest canopy. Within hours, the first C-47s began to fly over Bastogne, dropping supplies by parachute. Boxes of ammunition, food, medicine, boots, radios. Some landed inside the perimeter, others were recovered under enemy fire. Relief was immediate, but not enough. The next day, explosions were heard to the south. They were not Germans. It was General George Patton's Third Army, which had turned its axis of advance in a maneuver of desperate daring. He had marched north with his armored divisions in hellish conditions, crossing destroyed roads, nameless villages, and enemy fire. On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division succeeded in opening a corridor to Bastogne. The previous days had been an ordeal of shadows, snow, and death. The Ardennes skies, laden with grey clouds, seemed to be made of lead. The Allied divisions, trapped at the front, were blind and deaf. No air support, no visibility to observe the enemy, no reliable communications in the midst of the whiteout. The trees exploded with every artillery hit. The men, immobile in their ice trenches, were transformed into figures of frozen mud. In this total darkness, the Wehrmacht had advanced further than anyone thought possible. But December 23rd dawned differently. Along the front, from Houffalize to Saint-Vith, a light broke through the fog with the force of a revelation. The sky, for the first time in a week, was clear. The snow glistened under a sun that seemed unrecognizable. In that instant, the Germans lost their greatest advantage. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow, could not take off, and the sky filled with the roar of thousands of Allied engines. P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang and Typhoon fighter bombers began to appear over the German columns, which until then had moved with relative freedom. What had been a spearhead offensive became a mousetrap. The long columns of trucks, tanks, mobile fuel depots and self-propelled guns began to burst one after another under surgical strikes. The snow was dyed black. Roads were clogged with craters and twisted iron. The accuracy of the aerial fire was devastating. Every bridge the Germans tried to cross was destroyed before it was completed. Every forest they hid in was sprayed with napalm. In the heart of the chaos, the 101st Airborne Division was still holding out against the siege of Bastogne, but now, for the first time, crates of ammunition, supplies, and medicine began to fall from the C-47s. Colored parachutes fluttered like banners in the snow. The wounded were again given morphine. Browning machine guns roared again. The howitzer batteries, which had been mute for days, regained their thunderous voice. Bastogne did not surrender. It bled in silence until the sky decided to turn blue. In parallel, more than 100 kilometers to the south, another front was on the move. General George S. Patton had promised the impossible, to move 3 armored divisions of the Third Army northward, turning its axis of operations and attacking perpendicular to the German advance. For days, his men had marched without pause on icy roads, crossing destroyed villages and over impossible routes. They advanced without sleep, mounted on frost-covered tanks, with engineers clearing snow under enemy fire. The Shore River crossing was a logistical nightmare, but Patton did not stop. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the first units of the 4th Armored Division hit the outer line of the German encirclement of Bastogne. The fighting was brutal: ambushes, anti-tank grenades, Panzerfaust from snowy barns. But Patton's men advanced every meter with nails, shrapnel, and rage. Every hill captured was another step toward the besieged paratroopers. On December 26th, a small patrol succeeded in contacting elements of the 326th Engineer Division south of Bastogne. The connection was made, the encirclement was broken. Meanwhile, in the northern sector, the situation was beginning to change as well. Montgomery, from the British command, had reorganized part of the front and sent reinforcements towards Dinant and Marche. The British tanks of the 29th Armoured Brigade arrived to the combat in the middle of villages devastated by the German retreat. The fighting in Celles in particular became decisive. There, German columns were caught between British armoured forces and aerial fire, losing dozens of tanks and vehicles. The advance towards the Meuse, Hitler's central objective, was halted for good. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, began to understand the magnitude of the problem. The armoured units, stretched like snakes along destroyed roads, could neither retreat nor advance. The fuel tanks had been exhausted. Many tanks were abandoned. The infantry divisions, exhausted and without adequate shelter, were beginning to freeze in their positions. And the enemy, now revitalized, was counter-attacking from both sides. The German offensive, which had begun with a roar, was now creaking under its own weight. The surprise had evaporated. The weather, which was supposed to protect the attackers, had become their greatest traitor. And the Luftwaffe, practically absent, watched from its frozen runways as the air dominance was once again total for the Allies. The villages between Bastogne and Houffalize witnessed frozen carnage. Every house became a point of resistance. Every forest became a tank graveyard. The German forces that had advanced with impetus were now hunted down relentlessly. The front was stabilizing, but not for the attackers. In the trenches, among the trees broken by artillery, lay the frozen bodies of soldiers who would never again see the clear sky that had sealed their fate. Tank duels. The Battle of the Bulge was not only a fight for surprise or for routes, it was also a brutal duel between steel and steel, between the feared German panzers and the Sherman tanks of the U.S. Army. And that duel on the icy roads of Belgium took on apocalyptic dimensions. The Germans went for their heaviest card. The Panthers, with their fearsome KWK 42-75mm high-velocity gun, were the kings of the distance. Camouflaged on the flanks of the advance, from the hills or between destroyed farmhouses, they opened fire with surgical precision before being seen. And when conditions permitted, the Tiger IIs, armored giants that advanced at a slow pace but with armor impenetrable to Allied projectiles at more than 500 meters, entered the battlefield. Their 88mm gun was capable of piercing an M4 Sherman from side to side as if it were wet cardboard. But the Americans did not fight alone with their material. They fought with their doctrine. Sherman tanks were lighter, faster, more maneuverable. On the narrow roads of the Ardennes, that could be a deadly advantage. While the Tiger IIs got stuck in sharp turns or on wooden bridges that wouldn't support their weight, the M4s slipped into columns, ambushed, fired, and retreated. When operating in tandem, with artillery and fighter-bomber support, they could neutralize even the German colossi. But they paid dearly. For every Panther destroyed, at least 3 Shermans were turned into torches. One of the fiercest encounters took place at Saint-Vith on December 20th to 21st. The German 116th Panzer Division, supported by armor of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, encountered elements of the American 7th Armored Division. The streets of the town became an inferno. Shermans fired from basements, Panthers fired back through walls, bazookas pounded caterpillars, and artillery rocked every building every few minutes. For 2 days, the columns locked in a dance of fire. Panthers would enter from a street and be attacked from the windows. Shermans flanked across the square and fell into side ambushes. Neither side managed to break the balance of that urban clash. Only devastation remained. At Noville, north of Bastogne, another memorable engagement took place between tank men of the U.S. 10th Armored Division and elements of the Panzer Lehr. There, the American soldiers dug their tanks into a defensive position, covering the approaches with crossfire. The Panthers arrived en masse, but not with sufficient speed. Several were hit from concealed positions before they could deploy. The Shermans, knowing they were technically inferior, played to close the gap, encircle and strike from the flanks. In that encounter, the icy terrain and destroyed villages forced the Germans to fight as at Stalingrad, house to house, tank to tank. But not all was successful resistance. In the assault on Sadzot, Kampfgruppe Peiper, equipped with Tiger IIs of SS Panzer Abteilung 501, swept through an American position without encountering any real opposition. The first shots burst the lighter armor. The American tanks fell back or were destroyed. The fire-lit night revealed an unstoppable column. Only fuel shortages, road chaos, and subsequent infantry resistance prevented Peiper from advancing further. In open field engagements, the difference was lethal. The Tiger II, when it had line of fire and forward observer support, was almost invincible. Its front could withstand any American shell. At La Glaise, one of these monsters was abandoned not because of damage, but because it simply ran out of fuel. The men of Kampfgruppe Peiper destroyed it with their bare hands before abandoning it. Today, it is still there. The Allied response came from the sky. On December 24th and 25th, when the weather cleared, Allied fighter bombers began hunting tanks with devastating accuracy. A Tiger II could withstand a hit from a 76mm cannon, but not the direct hit from a 500-pound bomb dropped from a Typhoon or Thunderbolt. Many German armored vehicles were hit while crossing bridges or refueling. Some caught fire with their crews inside. Black smoke from rocket-hit gasoline tanks filled the valleys. As the offensive collapsed, tank encounters became less frequent and more desperate. Many panzers could not advance for lack of fuel or were trapped by blown bridges. Shermans, on the other hand, flowed en masse with the Allied counterattack. In fighting near Houffalize and Mannheim, American forces, now with air and numerical superiority, began to close the encirclement. The German tanks, unable to escape, were destroyed or abandoned. Exhaustion of the German offensive. The German infantry advanced between trees covered with frost. The wind shook the branches and each gust brought snow down on the helmets. Frozen rifles had to be held close to the chest, wrapped in damp rags, to prevent the bolt from sealing. In many sectors, the attacks were silent, with no artillery or tank support. Just bodies crawling through the brush, bayonets at the ready, eyes fixed. In the clearings, American paratroopers had built improvised defenses using fallen logs, sandbags, hardened ice, and anti-personnel mines. Wherever the Germans tried to advance, they were repulsed at point-blank range. One of the places where the fighting reached its most primitive form was the Bois Jacques between Bastogne and Foy. There, the men of Easy Company of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment dug their holes among frozen roots. They slept under snow-covered tarpaulins, ate frozen canned meat, and urinated in helmets because getting out of the hole meant a bullet in the head. German patrols marauded every night. There were knife fights, bodies found at dawn with their throats cut open, rifles jammed by ice. Death did not come from far away. It walked among the trees. In the woods near Elsenborn Ridge, American troops of the 5th Corps withstood wave after wave of German assaults. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division crashed into the defensive lines amid a blizzard of snow and fire. Trees, hit by artillery, exploded into razor-sharp splinters of wood capable of piercing a body. The soldiers dug under the dead trees among roots and broken branches and fought through the fog, guided only by the cries of the wounded. The line did not move. It froze in the mud and became more and more cruel. In these woods also lurked the last German attempt to gain time. Without enough fuel, with the tanks trapped by the terrain and the weather, the SS began to send in their special groups, camouflaged, disguised, speaking English learned the hard way. Operation Greif dispersed German commandos dressed as American military police who spread paranoia on the roads and in the camps. Deep in the forest, no man knew whether the one walking from the north was a comrade or an assassin. Interrogations at checkpoints became absurd. Questions about baseball teams, names of cartoon characters, or addresses in New York were used as an impromptu filter. Sometimes they worked. Other times the enemy had already passed. But as the woods filled with smoke and fear, something deeper was beginning to crack, the machinery of the German offensive. What had been an ambitious operation was turning into a directionless juggernaut. Roads were blocked by their own vehicles. Fuel, so carefully rationed, was being lost in drums abandoned by columns that never reached the front. Many Tiger and Panther were simply left on the side of the road without a drop in the tank. The infantry, exhausted, slept on their feet. Radios did not work because of the cold. Wires were cut, orders arrived late or never. The logistic chain was collapsing. The artillery had no ammunition. The Luftwaffe, cornered on ice-covered runways, could not take off. And the enemy, who at first retreated in disorder, now counterattacked with fury. Every forest conquered by the Germans was surrounded by fresh American units. Every captured junction was bombed from the air, and every attempt to reorganize a defensive line ended up being overwhelmed by armored divisions coming from the south. The American 2nd Armored Division swept the western flank. The remnants of Kampfgruppe Peiper, out of fuel and without support, scattered among the frozen hills and abandoned their tanks one by one, setting them on fire. The woods were filled with scrap metal. The heavens opened over Houffalize on January 13th. For weeks, the region had been shrouded in a thick fog that dulled light, muffled sound, and obscured movement. Now, suddenly, the sun revealed a devastated landscape, blackened hills, trees broken like matchsticks, tanks abandoned in the ditches, and corpses covered in a thin layer of frost. What unfolded before the eyes of the Allied pilots was the skeleton of a collapsed offensive. At that instant, the trap closed. From the north, the American First Army was descending. From the south, Patton's Third Army was rising with fury, tearing through the center of the German salient. In the middle, trapped, were the elite forces that had spearheaded the attack: SS armor, remnants of Volksgrenadier divisions, paratrooper units, and scattered commandos. Maps of Allied headquarters showed an accurate picture. A perfect pincer with Houffalize in the center. The neck of the salient was reduced to a strip barely 20 kilometers wide, and through it more than 30,000 German soldiers were to escape, with dozens of tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces necessary to continue the fighting in the whole sector. The withdrawal did not take place in order as expected. Windshieldless trucks full of wounded men sped along icy roads. Semi-tracks with loose tracks were pushed by tractors. Quartermaster officers distributed the last of the fuel by hand, without records, without planning. The roads were in chaos. At every bend, a Panther was left on the side of the road, a Kübelwagen with its trunk smashed, a howitzer abandoned for lack of horses. On the roofs of the houses, German snipers tried to stop the Allied advance with isolated shots, but they were quickly eliminated by mortar fire or saturation artillery bombardment. Roads leading eastward toward La Roche, toward Gouvy, toward Wiltz were attacked from the air in broad daylight. British Typhoon and American Thunderbolt fighter bombers patrolled unopposed, with total freedom. They would spot columns, drop rockets, and come back for more. Every junction, every intersection was marked with fire. Ice melted under the explosions, turning the roads into thick mud. Wheels skidded. Vehicles crashed into each other. There was no room to turn. There was no time to repair. Those who could not go on had to abandon everything and continue on foot. The Author River, which meandered near Houffalize, became a line of despair. German columns tried to cross it on battered bridges, some improvised with planks, others covered with snow. Explosions burst all around them. The waters turned black with oil spilled from the vehicles hit. Soldiers crossed clutching ropes, some carrying wounded on their shoulders. Those who fell were dragged by the current under blocks of ice. There was no rear guard, only the front that crumbled behind every step. The men of the 2nd U.S. Armored Division advanced with method and rage. Their armored columns moved along the flanks, ramming what was left of the enemy lines. In the surrounding villages, such as Wibrin or Compone, the fighting was brief and violent. Tanks opened fire at point-blank range on houses where German squads were sheltering. Soldiers would throw grenades through the windows and then shoot their way in. Sometimes they found only burned bodies or unarmed soldiers, frozen, shivering. Other times, a well-placed machine gun cost 5 or 6 lives before it was silenced. Not many prisoners were taken. In the air hung the feeling that everything had crossed a boundary. In the streets of Houffalize, only the stragglers remained. Wounded German soldiers crawling through the rubble, quartermaster officers burning papers in jerry cans, motorcyclists searching for a route that no longer existed. Many tanks were sabotaged by their own crews. Charges were placed in the breach, tanks were set on fire, gears were broken. Better to destroy everything before leaving it to the enemy. In the town square, a Panther held position for 2 days as the only improvised defense. It had been hit by a 76mm shell that tore off its tracks but still retained its cannon. 2 soldiers were firing with limited ammunition. Then, when they were surrounded, they killed themselves inside the vehicle. The hatch was frozen. Smoke poured out of the slots like a slow sigh. On January 16th, Allied tanks entered Houffalize without organized resistance. The place was an amalgam of ruins, smoke, and silence. In every street there were overturned vehicles, field bikes with bent wheels, ownerless boots, empty cartridges, military mail bags with frozen letters. In a cellar, a group of German nurses cared for wounded men with bandages frozen to their bodies. They had been waiting for orders for 3 days that never came. When the Americans found them, they raised their hands without speaking. The retreat to the Rhine began without planning, without defense, without glory. The German columns crossed the Siegfried Line in disorder. Many did so without weapons, without units, without superiors. They were shadows of their former selves. The maps of the German High Command no longer showed advances, only losses. The divisions were so decimated that in the reports they were unified under generic names. Group A, remains of the 2nd Corps, mixed elements. Fuel was still insufficient. Some tanks were dragged with mules, others were converted into fixed firing positions. The Rhine River, frozen in many stretches, became the new boundary. Left behind were the blood-stained forests, the villages reduced to rubble, Hitler's dreams buried under the snow. But for the men who had survived Houffalize, there was no sense of return, only cold tiredness and the emptiness of a defeat that had not yet come to terms with itself. Peiper withdraws. The retreat was neither orderly, nor strategic, nor progressive. It was a silent and chaotic collapse, disguised as a tactical movement. The maps that the General Staff had drawn with bold arrows toward the Meuse were covered over with withdrawal orders, hasty annotations, and front lines that no longer existed. The great German salient that had formed after the December offensive was deflating under constant fire, caught between the hammers of Patton's Third Army to the south and the U.S. First Army to the north. In the middle of this pincer, the panzer divisions were bleeding to death. The first to break were the most advanced, those that had managed to get beyond Bastogne. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had reached the outskirts of Dinant, was ordered to fall back on December 27th. What had been an armoured push turned into an impromptu retreat. Their tanks, low on fuel, could not cover the same distance as on the outward journey. Many were abandoned, camouflaged with branches in ditches, blown up by their own crews or pushed into rivers. The same happened to the light armoured reconnaissance and transport columns. Opel Blitz trucks, half-tracks and tracked tractors were stuck in the mud or caught in American ambushes. The roads leading back east were collapsed. narrow roads covered with ice and mud, paraded with broken tanks, exhausted infantry divisions, wounded wagons, captured vehicles, and villagers evacuating in the opposite direction. Sometimes convoys were held up for hours, trapped by fallen trees or burning vehicles. On more than one occasion, Allied aircraft broke up the formation with lightning attacks. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers roamed the valleys at low altitude, strafing and rocketing anything that moved. The retreat was not only dangerous, it was humiliating. Kampfgruppe Peiper, spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, was isolated after the fighting at La Glaise. After the Malmedy Massacre and attempts to break through to the west, Peiper found himself surrounded. He tried to hold his position for a week. When there was no food or ammunition left, he ordered his staff to abandon the armor and flee on foot through the forest. More than 1,000 men escaped through the snow toward the German lines. Of the nearly 150 vehicles that made up his column, not one was spared. The Leibstandarte was maimed. Peiper, with frozen feet, was evacuated to Germany with only a handful of officers. The remaining panzer divisions, such as the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, had begun the offensive with more than 100 tanks each. By mid-January, they could barely muster squadrons with 3 or 4 operational vehicles. The open fields in the north, especially in the Mannheim and Welsam region, had become armoured graveyards. The Panthers, too heavy to maneuver in the frozen mud, were easy targets for the Shermans' 76mm guns. American M10 anti-tank guns and M36 tank destroyers learned to ambush them on narrow roads, where their turret took too long to turn. The older and more vulnerable Panzer IVs were destroyed by direct fire or abandoned when they ran out of ammunition. German officers tried to organize defensive lines along the Urte River, but bridges were destroyed and the retreating divisions would not obey orders. On several occasions, chaotic fighting broke out between groups that crossed each other without knowing whether the other was enemy or ally. Discipline dissolved as hunger, cold, and frustration increased. Many soldiers marched without weapons, their faces covered by woolen scarves, stolen from evacuated houses. The winter was crueler now that the offensive had failed. There was no glory, no advance, no honor, only retreat. Throughout the forests of St. Hubert and Wiltz, small German detachments tried to resist the pressure of Sherman tanks and Allied infantry battalions. Some companies clung to the hills, fighting until they ran out of ammunition. Desperate clashes broke out in villages like Flamierge and Loutrebrois, where the SS and Wehrmacht held out like garrisons from another time, waiting for orders that no longer came. Many were surrounded and captured, others simply disappeared in the snow. The 116th Panzer Division, also called Windhund, tried to organize a local counter-offensive in the region of Houffalize, but to no avail. Its tanks numbered no more than a dozen, the artillery was in disarray, and the infantry scattered. The commander requested permission to withdraw on January 10th. Thereafter, the division became a shadow, retreating along forest roads and leaving behind more than 70% of its heavy equipment. By mid-January, the withdrawal was no longer a movement. It was an exodus. The terrain was strewn with corpses, charred tanks, and dead horses. The panzer divisions that had once represented the pride of the German military machine were now skeleton columns, crossing icy rivers by improvised passes, abandoning positions without a fight, leaving behind even wounded and medics. The priority was to get out alive. When on January 16th the front stabilized near the original pre-attack line, hardly any vestiges of panzer power remained. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht tried to disguise the failure as an orderly withdrawal, but the numbers were irrefutable. More than 700 tanks lost, most to total destruction. Elite divisions reduced to incomplete battle groups. the strategic armoured reserve depleted. The Ardennes, which had seen the birth of the Blitzkrieg 5 years earlier, now became the scene of its agony. The same roads that had led Guderian and Rommel to the Seine now returned their heirs in defeated columns. Bled and without future, there would not be another offensive.